Have you ever felt like history only tells you half the story? The polished version, carved in stone, signed by popes and kings, but never the whispers that slipped through the cracks. Tonight, I want you to do something simple. Put your phone down for a moment. Let your eyes rest. Maybe even close them. Just listen. Because what we're about to explore isn't a bedtime tale. It's a labyrinth of secrets, stretching from the Vatican's hidden vaults to the ashes of the Knights Templar. This is a story about bloodlines said to shape thrones, about parchments burned yet remembered, about cathedrals that still hide symbols carved by trembling hands 7 centuries ago. It's a story of power and silence, of loyalty and betrayal, of myths that refuse to die. And before we descend together, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? I find it extraordinary that across oceans and time zones, we gather here, connected by nothing more than curiosity and the courage to look where others turn away. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe. It's free and it helps me keep digging into the shadows. Because tonight, we begin tracing a trail that was never meant to be followed. Have you ever looked at a date on the calendar and felt a strange shiver? For some people, it's Friday the 13th. We joke about it today as if it's just bad luck, but that superstition began on a very real night, more than 700 years ago. A night when one of the most powerful brotherhoods in Europe was erased in a single stroke. It was October 13th, 1307. Paris slept under heavy clouds, rain dripping from the cathedral roofs. But in the alleys and narrow streets, soldiers were moving silently, not in their usual patrols, but in formation. At dawn's first light, they would strike. The Knights Templar, once the protectors of pilgrims, once the defenders of Jerusalem, were about to be betrayed by the very crown they had served. Across France, doors were broken, men dragged out in chains, accusations of heresy shouted into the cold air. Their white mantles, marked with the red cross, were torn away. The chronicles tell us of arrests, of torture, of confessions squeezed from broken bodies, but there is something the official records never say. Not every Templar was caught, and not every secret died in those cells. There is a story, whispered, half-hidden in old letters and oral traditions, that one knight vanished from the roundup that morning. He slipped into the chaos with something more precious than gold or relics, not a chest of treasure, but a child. Imagine the scene, the fortress of the temple broken, torches flaring against the rain, men shouting, horses stamping in the mud. And in the shadows, one man, cloak soaked through, pressing a small hand into his own. A boy's hand. Perhaps his son, perhaps a nephew, perhaps something more mysterious still. This knight did not run toward safety. He ran into the storm. And here, if you listen closely, is where the story begins to change, because what he carried that night was not just blood of his body, but blood of an idea. The storm carried them out of the city. Hooves splashed mud onto stone, and the rain blurred the line between earth and sky. The boy stumbled, but the knight lifted him without a word, pressing forward into the darkness. Behind them, bells tolled from the cathedral, not for worship, but for capture. They reached the forest edge before dawn. The pines moaned under the wind, branches dripping like tears. Here, in the shelter of the trees, the knight finally paused. He knelt by an old oak, pulled a small dagger from his belt, and carved into the bark a symbol, a cross with 2 lines, one hidden inside the other. The boy watched with wide eyes. He didn't understand. Not yet. The knight whispered to him, words the wind almost carried away. This is for those who come after. If the books erase us, the trees will remember. Hours passed. They crossed rivers that ran high with rain, fields where farmers stood watching in silence, recognizing the cloak but saying nothing. In a quiet village, The knight left a mark on a stone well, the same cross, scratched faintly where only a careful eye would see. By nightfall, the boy asked the question he had been holding back. "Will we ever go home?" The knight looked at him for a long moment. His voice was steady, but heavy, like iron laid on wood. "Home is not a place anymore. Home is what you carry inside, and what you carry, child, is all that remains of us. The boy's name is gone from the records like ink washed away by rain. But the traces remain, not in books, but in whispers. Some said he was hidden in a monastery, dressed in plain wool, taught to sing prayers he barely understood. Others believed he was placed with farmers, his hair cut short, his accent softened until he was just another village child. But there were always hints. In the monastery, he drew strange symbols in the margins of hymnals, tiny crosses doubled inside one another, circles with hidden marks. In the villages, he was known for gazing too long at the horizon, as if waiting for someone who would never return. And when the wind carried the toll of church bells, he would grow still, listening as though the sound was more than metal striking air. The knight who carried him vanished from the chronicles. Maybe he fell on the road, maybe he survived. But what mattered is this: the child did not vanish. He lived, and with him lived the last fragment of something larger, a bloodline, an idea, a thread too stubborn to be cut. The world had moved on. Kings traded treaties, priests debated scripture, and common folk tilled the earth. But somewhere in the shadows of Europe, in a monastery cell or a cottage by the river, a boy carried the memory of the temple in his blood. And memory has a way of surviving, even when empires fall. Years passed. The boy grew into a youth, and though the world around him changed, something inside remained unshaken. In the village, he worked the fields like any other. He learned to cut wheat, to mend fences, to guide oxen through furrows. But his hands, though strong, always lingered too long on certain motions. He would pause to mark symbols into the soil, lines that meant nothing to others but carried weight for him. In the monastery, he was praised for his quiet discipline. He copied manuscripts without complaint, his script steady, his patience remarkable. Yet the margins of his pages told another story: circles, sigils, and the repeating emblem of a cross within cross. The monks saw them as childish doodles. To him, they were memory anchors, threads to hold on to in silence. There were nights when he would slip from his cell and climb the cloister roof. From there, he would watch the stars and whisper names he could barely recall. The words were broken, fragments of a tongue not quite Latin, not quite French. He didn't know their meaning, but he knew their rhythm. It was a rhythm passed to him in whispers by a man he barely remembered, the knight whose hand had once closed over his. By his adolescence, people noticed things. When he passed through a churchyard, dogs would bark and then whine, shrinking back as though they sensed something old and unyielding in him. When he prayed, his voice carried a weight that unsettled even the abbots. And when he spoke of scripture, he wove meanings that seemed too deep for his age, as though the words were doors only he had been given the keys to. It wasn't that he claimed power. It was that power seemed to claim him, and so whispers followed him, whispers of a bloodline too stubborn to die. Some said he was touched by angels, others muttered he was shadowed by heretics. But none denied this. Wherever he walked, the memory of the Templars walked with him. By the time he reached manhood, the youth could no longer hide the marks of difference. It began with the harvest. The village had prayed for rain, and when the storm finally came, he walked into the fields as if guided by instinct. While others sheltered, he lifted his hands and traced in the mud a symbol he had drawn since childhood, the cross with its hidden double. The storm broke around him, sparing the wheat where he stood. Farmers whispered of a blessing. The abbot, hearing of it, called it blasphemy. Soon after, the whispers grew sharper. In the cloister, a senior monk accused him of carrying secrets not meant for God's house. A hymnal was discovered with symbols etched too deep, as though meant to survive centuries. The youth did not deny it. He simply closed the book and said softly, "If you erase the memory, the stones will remember." That night, the monastery bell tolled, not for prayer, but for judgment. A tribunal of monks sat in silence, deciding whether he was touched by grace or by heresy. Yet something intervened. A rider arrived at the gates, cloaked against the rain. He carried no seal, no letter of authority, only words passed from one mouth to another. The boy was to be spared. Not freed, but moved, transferred, hidden elsewhere where fewer eyes could see. And so, in the middle of a storm, he was taken once again from all he knew. As the hoofbeats faded into the night, he did not look back at the monastery's stone walls. He only traced the mark on his wrist, invisible but real, and whispered to himself, "I will remember." It was the first time he realized his life was not his own. He was a vessel, of blood, of memory, of a promise sworn centuries before his birth. Europe in the early 14th century was not a safe place for loose whispers. Power moved on parchment and blade alike, and once a rumor was born, it could travel faster than an army. The rumor was simple, almost laughable in its fragility. A child had escaped the night of the arrests. But fragility is not the same as weakness. In a world where legitimacy often rested on bloodlines, the notion that a living heir of the temple might walk unseen was enough to keep lords awake in the dark. Across abbeys and castles, questions sharpened into hunts. The Inquisition had barely found its teeth, and now it was eager for a quarry. Clerics asked probing questions in villages along the Loire. Had anyone seen a boy with strange habits, strange markings? Some swore they had, some swore they hadn't, but every answer was dangerous. The king's men were less subtle. They rode into towns with iron at their sides, demanding oaths and extracting names. A farmer who had once offered bread to a silent youth now found himself beaten for it. A monk who had glimpsed symbols carved into a hymnal was dragged into questioning, and through it all, the youth, now nearing manhood, felt the noose tightening. He could no longer sit in the choir stalls without sensing eyes upon him. He could no longer walk a village road without hearing the hoofbeat of pursuit in the distance. He remembered the knight's words, whispered in the rain so many years before. Home is what you carry inside. But now, home felt like a burden, something bright enough to betray him if ever revealed. So he learned to move differently, to erase his footprints in the mud, to leave no candle burning in a room too long, to carve his symbols only where water and moss might swallow them. Memory had to be hidden to survive. Yet even as he concealed, he discovered. In a half-ruined library near Poitiers, he found a manuscript margin marked with the same cross within cross he had drawn since childhood. It was not his alone. Others had known, others had remembered. For the first time he realized he was not a lone survivor. He was part of something larger, threads still weaving beneath the surface, unseen but unbroken. The young survivor thought he was alone. For years he believed he was the last thread of a broken tapestry, but the world has strange ways of whispering when you listen closely. It began in the market of a quiet riverside town. He was there only to buy a small cask of oil, hood pulled low, blending in with the crowd. When the cooper rolled the barrel across the stall, the boy's eyes caught a detail no one else would have noticed, a tiny carving hidden on the inside of the rim. A cross within a cross, the same sign he had drawn in secret since childhood. The cooper didn't smile, didn't wink. He only said in the voice of a man selling wood, "Oak lasts longer in wet weather." To anyone else, it was meaningless. To the boy, it was a signal, a message. You are not alone. From that day forward, he began to see it everywhere. A chalk line beneath a church bench, a pattern of stitches in the corner of a cloth. A candle left burning all night in a side chapel that should have been dark. Small things. Ordinary things. But they carried the same silent weight. These signs pointed to people. Men and women who are not knights, not warriors, but ordinary folk. Masons, ferrymen, innkeepers, scribes. Each one held a fragment of the past. They didn't speak the forbidden name of the Templars. They didn't need to. Their marks and their silences were enough. This quiet network gave him shelter. An innkeeper might leave one room off the ledger. A ferryman might row across the river at midnight without asking for coin. A farmer's wife might place a loaf of bread on a windowsill, its crust marked with a faint cross. These were not grand gestures, but they meant survival. Through them, he learned rules passed down in whispers. Never meet twice in the same place. Speak only of weather and crops. Leave no sign that rain cannot wash away. It was not an army. It was something harder to kill, a memory that had scattered and hidden itself in 1,000 ordinary hands. The king's men still searched, riding from town to town, asking questions, dragging people into halls to answer. But when they left, the boy remained. He had become part of something greater than himself, something that did not need banners or swords to endure. For the first time, he understood. The order was not destroyed. It was alive, broken into pieces, waiting for the moment when those pieces might be gathered again. The years passed, and the boy became a young man. He no longer hid like a frightened child, though the fear never truly left him. He worked where he could, mending fences, hauling wood, singing psalms when asked, always moving before questions grew too sharp. But as he grew, so did the whispers about him. Neighbors noticed things they could not explain. His memory for old prayers seemed too exact, too ancient, as if the words had been learned in a place he had never seen. He carried symbols in his mind, geometries, crosses, and circles, that no teacher had given him. When he worked with stone, his hands moved as if guided, tracing lines that matched the hidden marks of masons he had never met. One winter night, after a fever that nearly killed him, he woke with a scar on his chest. It was not from the illness. It was older, deeper, as though it had been waiting beneath his skin until the fever pulled it to the surface. The mark was faint but unmistakable. A cross within cross, like the carving on the cooper's barrel. The old woman who nursed him gasped when she saw it. She whispered words he almost didn't hear. The blood remembers. From that moment, the rumors began to spread. Some called him blessed, others cursed. Children ran from him in the street. Priests grew uneasy when he crossed their doors. The scar itself was no ordinary wound. It seemed to glow pale in moonlight or darken when storms rolled in, though he never spoke of this aloud. He carried the mark in silence, but inside he wondered. Was it proof of what he had always feared? That he was not only a survivor of the Night of Fire, but the heir of something far older, something carried not only in memory, but in blood. Rumors travel faster than truth. What began as a whisper in a sick room soon carried itself into marketplaces, taverns, and cloisters. They spoke of a young man with a strange scar, a mark that no illness could carve, no blade could explain. Some swore they had seen it shining faintly beneath his shirt when the moon was high. Others claimed the mark was hot to the touch, as if fire itself had branded him. In villages, the tales grew wild. One man said the youth could calm animals with a glance. A woman claimed he prayed in a language she had never heard, but felt she almost understood. Each story added weight to the fear. This was no ordinary survivor. This was something the church had failed to erase. Word reached the ears of priests, then bishops. For the church, symbols mattered more than swords. A scar in the shape of the forbidden cross was not just superstition, it was threat. If the people believed in him, he could become a rallying point, proof that the temple had not been destroyed but lived on in flesh and blood. And so, men were sent to listen. They did not arrive as soldiers. They came as confessors, merchants, wandering friars. They asked questions in careful tones. Had anyone seen a boy with unusual marks? Did anyone speak of dreams, visions, bloodlines? Their words carried the weight of heresy, and heresy was a death sentence. The young man felt the net tightening again. He could no longer linger in one place. A baker who had once given him bread now turned away, afraid of being seen with him. The mason who had shown him secret symbols was questioned and disappeared. The network still protected him, but even they whispered now, wondering if keeping him alive was worth the danger. One night, as he crossed a field lit only by starlight, he realized the truth. His mark was not just a scar, it was a signal, a beacon that drew both allies and enemies, and as long as it remained, he would never be safe. But safety was no longer his only concern. The bloodline was not meant to hide forever. It was meant to endure, and that meant someone had to carry it forward no matter the cost. By the early 14th century, the Church had mastered the art of silence. Not the silence of prayer, but the silence of erasure. A name spoken too loudly could vanish from the records. A family line could disappear overnight. And when whispers of a living heir to the temple reached Rome, silence became their sharpest weapon. It began quietly. A single parchment slipped across a bishop's desk. Investigate the boy. No name, no village. Only descriptions vague enough to fit a dozen faces, but sharp enough to keep the hunters moving. A youth marked by the sign of the cross within a cross, prone to visions, followed by shadows of loyalty. The Inquisition moved not like armies, but like smoke. Friars with sandaled feet knocked on cottage doors. Confessors leaned close in dark corners of churches. A merchant's wagon brought more than spices. It carried eyes and heirs, and the questions were always the same. Have you seen a young man with a scar that glows in moonlight? Did a stranger ever draw a mark in the dust? Has anyone spoken of the temple in secret? Villages began to tremble under the weight of these questions. People looked at one another differently. A kind gesture could suddenly be suspicion. A loaf of bread left on a doorstep might mean complicity. The youth, now no longer a boy, but not yet a man, felt it everywhere. When he walked into a tavern, conversations thinned. When he paused too long at a chapel, heads turned. He was not famous, not yet, but he was being hunted as if he were. Still, there were nights when hope flickered. In a stone chapel lit by a single candle, a priest who should have turned him in instead pressed a key into his hand. "Beneath the floor," he whispered, "there is a passage that leads outside the walls. Remember, faith is not always where it pretends to be." The youth escaped that night, but as he crawled through the narrow passage, he understood something chilling. Every kindness he received put another life in danger. The net was tightening, not because the Church feared him alone, but because they feared the idea of him. So a living heir meant the order had not died. A bloodline meant a claim, and claims had the power to shake crowns. When fear alone was not enough, the Church gave fear a face. By the mid-1310s, reports about the scar had reached Rome in all their distorted forms. Some said it glowed, others swore it bled when touched. None of it could be proven, but that hardly mattered. What mattered was control, and for control, the Inquisition needed a story. So they crafted one. In sermons whispered across Europe, priests began to speak of the demon's mark. They told villagers that Satan branded his servants with false crosses, mockeries of Christ's wounds. Anyone bearing such a mark, they said, was not touched by heaven, but by hell. It was a clever move. Now the young man's scar was no longer a mystery or a relic of survival. It was, in the Church's voice, a sign of damnation. To shelter him was no longer an act of loyalty. It was an act of heresy. The consequences were swift A farmer's family was burned out of their home simply for refusing to answer questions. A midwife was dragged before a tribunal because she had once treated the boy's fever. A mason was hanged in a village square after admitting he had seen the scar but swore it was only flesh. Every punishment carried a message. The church would decide what a symbol meant, not the people. For the youth, each new decree cut deeper than any sword. His scar, once a private reminder of survival, had been stolen from him, twisted into a weapon to turn neighbors against neighbors. He could no longer trust even the silent signs of the hidden network. Too many were vanishing, broken under questions, or forced to deny him to save their children. And yet, in the ashes of this cruelty, he felt a strange resolve. If his blood was enough to frighten kings and cardinals, then his blood was not a curse. It was a power. The Inquisition had given him a role he had never chosen, not just a fugitive, but a symbol. And symbols, once set loose, are hard to kill. In Rome, behind the walls of the Apostolic Palace, there was a door most priests never saw. It was carved of oak, bound in iron, and opened only by a key carried on a chain by a single cardinal. To outsiders, it was simply another locked chamber in a city of locked chambers. But inside lay the thing Rome prized most. Silence, pressed into parchment. Here, under layers of dust and candle smoke, the church stored its shadows. Heresies recorded and condemned. Letters never meant for public eyes. Maps of places erased from official charts. And somewhere among these forbidden shelves lay the files marked with a single word. Milites, the soldiers, the Templars. The documents were not grand narratives. They were fragments. Half-burned letters, intercepted notes, confessions written under torture. But together, they told a story the church could never allow to surface. That blood had survived. That from the night of October 1307, when the king's men stormed the Templar houses, not all heirs had perished in the flames. One folder contained sketches of a mark said to appear on a child's chest, a cross within a cross. Another held maps with small circles around villages in Languedoc, Champagne, the Rhineland, even as far as the Scottish Isles. Each circle was accompanied by a note, suspected refuge. And then there was the most chilling page of all. A letter dated 1314, the year Grand Master Jacques de Molay was executed. In careful Latin script it warned, "As long as the blood walks, so too does the claim. Crown and tiara alike will tremble." The Vatican archivists did not debate the truth of these words. They were not philosophers or theologians. Their task was simpler, to keep such things hidden, for to admit even a whisper of them was to risk undoing everything the trials had accomplished. But secrets have a strange power. Even when locked away, they wait, and sooner or later, someone always finds the key. Not all who served the church were blind to its shadows. Some, given enough time and ink, began to see the patterns others tried to bury. Brother Matteo was one such man. A minor archivist, he was tasked with copying old manuscripts, repairing bindings, and keeping the endless catalogues in order. He had no rank to influence policy, no pulpit to thunder from, only a desk, a candle, and parchment that never seemed to end. And yet, in the quiet, Matteo noticed things. A map misfiled under pilgrimages that bore strange circles with Latin notes. A letter from a bishop in Champagne describing a boy marked by fire, tucked inside a volume of homilies. A sealed folder stamped with the word Milites, which he was not supposed to open but which had been left within reach for a single tempting night. Curiosity is dangerous in Rome. Matteo knew this. But night after night, as he traced faded ink, a picture began to form. The boy with the scar was no myth. He was part of something Rome feared, a thread of lineage that might lead back to the temple itself. What unsettled Matteo most was not the idea of survival, but the detail that kept repeating. The mark. always the same, crux in crux, a cross within a cross, sometimes drawn by trembling hands, sometimes with such precision that it looked almost like geometry. One evening, when the other archivists had gone, Matteo lingered. He spread the fragments before him, maps, sketches, confessions, warnings, and as he connected them, he felt a chill. The bloodline wasn't just a rumor. It was being tracked, village to village, generation to generation. The church had known all along. The question that clawed at him was simple. Why keep the record if the goal was to erase? Why not destroy every page? Unless, perhaps, the church feared destroying the proof would mean losing control over it. Matteo knew he should stop. Seal the folder, place it back, and pretend he had seen nothing. But he didn't. He copied a single page, the map of Languedoc with 3 villages circled in ink, and slipped it into the lining of his robe. His hand shook as he did it, knowing that if discovered, his life would be worth less than the candle burning at his desk. For weeks after, he walked the streets of Rome differently. Every sound behind him felt like footsteps, every priest's glance felt like suspicion, and yet something inside him burned brighter than fear. The bloodline was real, the truth existed, and perhaps, one day, it would not be locked in shadows, but spoken aloud. He had tried to live quietly, moving from town to town, never staying long enough for the soil to know his footsteps. But stories have a way of walking faster than the man who makes them. By the time he reached the markets of Burgundy, he heard it himself. A tale told by a drunk soldier about a youth who bore a scar that glowed in moonlight. In a monastery near the Rhine, he overheard novices whispering of a hidden heir who would one day rebuild the temple. And in a fishing village on the Breton coast, a child sang a rhyme about the boy with the burning cross, as though it had been a nursery song passed down for generations. The strangest part was that each version was different, yet all pointed to him. Some said he was 7 feet tall, others claimed he could heal wounds with a touch. A few whispered that he was no man at all, but the spirit of a knight returned from the ashes. The truth was simpler, but perhaps less satisfying. He was just one man, marked, hunted, and still alive. At first, he feared these stories. They painted a target on his back brighter than any scar. The Inquisition would not need to search far if villagers kept repeating his name. But as the weeks passed, fear gave way to something he had never expected. Resolve. Because if the people already believed, then belief itself had power. A king could kill a man, but not a rumor. A pope could burn records, but not silence a song sung by children. And perhaps that was why Rome feared him so deeply, not because of who he was, but because of what he represented. He realized then that he was no longer merely surviving. He was becoming something larger, something he had not chosen but could no longer escape. A legend written while he still breathed, and legends, once loosed into the world, are hard to chain again. They found him one evening in a ruined chapel on the edge of a forest. He had gone there for shelter, thinking the crumbling stone walls and broken altar would be safe enough for a single night's rest. But when he awoke, the fire was not his own. 3 men sat across from him, cloaked, their faces half lit in the glow. For a moment he reached for the knife at his belt, but they made no move. Instead, the oldest of them, his hair gray, his voice steady, spoke words that froze him in place. "We have waited for you." The youth said nothing, his hand still tight on the knife. The second man, broad-shouldered and scarred, pulled aside his sleeve. There, inked into his forearm, was a mark, a cross within a cross. Not burned into flesh like his own, but etched with deliberate care, a declaration of loyalty rather than birth. The youngest of the 3 offered him bread, speaking softly as though to calm a frightened animal. "You don't need to run from us. We run the same road. Your bloodline is not a curse. It is the last thread of what we swore to guard." For the first time in years, He felt a strange pull in his chest, not fear, not relief, but recognition. These men were not strangers. They were echoes, remnants of the same oath his ancestors had carried. Still, trust did not come easily. He asked them why they had sought him, why they risked their lives for a mark the church had named heresy. The grey-haired man leaned forward, his eyes sharp despite his age. Because the order is not dead. It cannot be. We are scattered, hunted, but not extinguished. And you, your blood, your survival, are proof. Proof that the fire did not consume everything. Proof that what was planted in Jerusalem still has roots. Silence filled the chapel, broken only by the wind sighing through the broken roof. He looked at the bread in his hands, then at the scarred man's arm, then at the fire that seemed to bind them together. For the first time, he wondered if running was no longer enough. Perhaps it was time to turn, not toward safety, but toward purpose. Because if legends could not be killed, then maybe legends could also be lived. The days that followed felt different than any he had known. For years, his life had been a rhythm of flight. Footsteps quickened by suspicion, meals swallowed in silence, nights broken by the rustle of imagined pursuers. Now for the first time, there was company. The three men traveled with him as if they had always been at his side. They walked the hidden paths through forests, skirted villages at dawn, and crossed rivers where the mist clung low. And though he had always hated questions, he found himself listening. Their stories, told in hushed voices by the campfire, pieced together a world he thought was gone. The scarred man spoke of a brotherhood in hiding, fragments of the temple that had survived like embers beneath ash. In the mountains of Aragon, a cellar held relics of the order. In Flanders, merchants whispered passwords over ledgers. In Scotland, knights rode beneath plain banners, their vows buried in silence but not forgotten. The younger one, restless and curious, told him of signs etched into stone bridges, of coded prayers sung in cathedrals, of coins stamped with subtle marks that only the loyal would notice. To the world, they were just scratches, just hymns, just currency. But to those who remembered, they were the threads of a tapestry, waiting to be rewoven. The old man, however, said little of the past. His eyes were fixed on what lay ahead. "Bloodlines," he murmured one evening, staring into the fire. "Rome fears them more than armies. Armies can be bought, broken, scattered. But blood carries memory. Blood carries claim, and a claim can rise centuries after you think it buried." The youth sat silent, his hand pressed over the scar on his chest. For the first time he wondered whether this mark was not simply a wound, but a seal the world would not let him forget. That night, as the others slept, he lay awake listening to the slow crackle of the dying fire. A thought, uninvited and sharp, took hold in him. He was no longer a fugitive alone in the dark. He was part of a current older than himself, a story that others had chosen to protect, and with every whisper of the wind against the ruined chapel walls, he felt less like prey and more like a man being prepared for something he had not yet dared to imagine. Weeks of wandering bound them together. What began as wary company grew into a rhythm, each man slipping into a role as if rehearsed by time itself. The scarred one scouted the paths, moving ahead with a hunter's caution. The younger one bartered in villages when supplies ran low, always returning with bread, salt, and news overheard in taverns. The elder walked with measured pace, guiding them as though he knew destinations long before they were spoken aloud. The youth, who had once been nameless in his own fear, now found himself carried by their momentum. He listened more than he spoke, but silence no longer felt like exile. Around their fire, he began to hear things not found in sermons or royal decrees, things that lingered in the hidden cracks of history. One evening, as they sheltered in the ruins of a monastery charred decades before, the elder revealed a truth that weighed heavier than any relic. "Do you think it chance," he said softly, "that Rome hunts you so fiercely? No, the Vatican fears not just your survival, but your inheritance." The youth frowned. "Inheritance? I have nothing. No lands, no gold, only this." He touched the scar that burned faintly in the candlelight. The elder's gaze did not waver. "Not wealth, boy. Memory. You carry the thread of a bloodline sworn in Jerusalem, blessed on the steps of the Temple Mount. The world believes it severed, but your existence says otherwise. And if blood still walks, then so too does the claim to stand where kings and popes have no wish you to stand." The words sank into him like iron sinking into water. He wanted to deny them, to retreat into the safety of anonymity. Yet as he stared at the broken stones of the monastery, he could not. The Inquisition's fury, the whispered songs, the men who risked their lives to find him, none of it matched the life of a mere fugitive. He was something more, whether he wished it or not. That night he dreamt of a hall lit by torches, banners red and white hanging like shadows of fire. Men stood in rows, their faces hidden by time, yet every one of them turned toward him. And at the far end of the hall, a single voice spoke words he did not understand, yet felt carved into his bones. Custos sanguinis. Keeper of the blood. When he woke, the fire had died to embers, but the words still echoed, too heavy to ignore. By the time spring reached them, the group had crossed valleys where the air smelled of thawing earth and rivers swollen with meltwater. Villages awoke with markets and festivals, yet the youth walked through them like a ghost. Faces turned when he passed, though no one knew his name. It was the scar, perhaps, or something less visible. The weight of stories already spun around him. One night they reached a small town in Languedoc, a place where old stone houses clung together as though bracing against centuries of storms. The scarred man led them to a cellar beneath a weaver's shop. There, by the flicker of a single lantern, waited others. Men and women, cloaked but unarmed. Their eyes carried the same recognition he had seen in the chapel weeks before. The elder gestured for him to sit at the circle's center. At first, he refused, but their quiet expectation pressed heavier than commands. Reluctantly, he lowered himself onto the rough bench. A woman, her hair streaked with silver, spoke first. "Do you know why you are here?" He shook his head. "You are proof," she said simply. "Proof that the temple's fire did not consume everything. Proof that blood still carries the vow." Another leaned forward, placing on the table a relic, a fragment of cloth, scorched but still bearing the faint red of a cross. "We have guarded what remained. Symbols, prayers, codes hidden in trade routes and in songs. But without blood, all is memory, and memory fades. With you, it breathes again." The youth stared at the relic, unable to speak. He wanted to say he was no savior, no leader, only a survivor of shadows. Yet the room's silence demanded more. Finally, he whispered, "What do you want of me?" The elder's reply was steady, final. Not to be what you are not, only to remain alive. For as long as you live, the claim lives. Rome can burn parchment, it can silence voices, but it cannot erase the blood that walks. The words fell like a seal upon his chest. He realized then that survival was no longer just his own. It was the survival of something older, something vast, and from that night on, he could never again think of himself as merely a fugitive. He was the thread they clung to, the thread Rome feared most. Days turned into weeks, and still the youth felt the weight of that cellar night pressing on him. Wherever he went afterward, eyes lingered. In markets, in churches, on winding roads through the hills, there was always someone who seemed to watch too long, as if testing whether the stories were true. The men who traveled with him tried to shield him, but whispers moved faster than any cloak. He heard them in taverns. The boy who carries the sign, the heir to the fire, the one Rome fears. Each version made him larger, stronger, more dangerous than reality. The truth that he was uncertain, unready, was swallowed whole by the legend taking his shape. In one mountain hamlet, an old shepherd pressed a loaf of bread into his hands without asking a word. For the journey, the man said, as though he already knew where the road would lead. In another village, a child traced the sign of the cross within cross on a wall, eyes wide with both awe and fear. It unsettled him to see himself reflected in symbols he had never chosen, but Rome's shadow lengthened with every step. One evening, as they sheltered in a barn, the scarred man returned from scouting with grim news. Riders in black cloaks had been seen moving south, their questions sharp, their purses heavy with coin. The Inquisition was tightening its net. The elder did not flinch. "It was always coming," he said. "Legends cannot remain in whispers forever. The Church will try to turn you from a sign of hope into a warning, a tale of blasphemy to frighten children. They will either claim to have found you and destroy you, or invent your destruction to kill the belief itself." The youth's throat felt dry. "And if I refuse both fates?" The elder's gaze was steady. "Then you must learn to shape the story yourself, because if you do not, Rome will." That night, sleep would not come. He lay awake, listening to the horses shifting in their stalls, the wind seeping through the cracks. For the first time he understood the danger was not only the hunt for his life, it was the struggle over meaning. Who he was, what he represented, what future might be born from his survival. These were battles being fought long before swords were drawn. And in that realization, a spark of resolve took root. If he could not escape the legend, perhaps he could learn to wield it. By summer, their path carried them northward, through lands where stone fortresses stood like teeth against the horizon. Each castle was a reminder that power here was measured not only in armies, but in symbols, flags, crests, bloodlines whispered in smoky halls. In a market town along the Seine, the youth overheard a merchant mutter to another, "They say one still walks, a child of the temple. Rome cannot kill them all." The words made his stomach twist, not with fear this time, but with an awareness of how far the whispers had spread. He was no longer a secret chased through forests. He was becoming a rumor that merchants traded like coin. At night he asked the elder, "What if they are wrong? What if I am no savior, no heir, just a boy carrying a scar?" The elder's eyes softened, but his reply was firm. "Legends do not require perfection. They require survival. Every day you live, the story breathes. And stories," he added with a faint smile, "outlive kingdoms." It was then that the youth began to notice changes in himself. When villagers offered bread, he no longer shrank from their gaze. When children whispered and pointed, he did not hide his chest. He felt the weight of fear, yes, but also a new kind of strength, a strange calm, as though the legend wrapping around him was less a prison than an armor. But shadows followed closely. One night, while crossing a river by torchlight, they heard hooves behind them. Riders. The scarred man cursed, urging them faster. For hours they pushed through the dark woods, branches tearing at their cloaks, until at last the hoofbeats faded. Yet the message was clear. Rome's hunt was no longer distant. It was here, on the same roads, breathing the same air. When dawn came, the youth stood at the river's edge, staring at his reflection rippling in the current. The scar across his chest burned faintly, as if reminding him of what he carried. He realized then that his life was no longer his alone. Each step he took pulled countless others with him, the hidden cells, the whispered songs, the faithful who waited for a sign. He whispered to his reflection, not sure if it was prayer or defiance. "As long as I walk, the bloodline walks." Autumn settled over the land, and with it came a strange quiet. The harvest filled villages with the smell of smoke and bread, yet the youth felt no peace. Each town he entered seemed to know of him before he arrived. Farmers nodded respectfully without asking his name. In a chapel carved from the rock of a hillside, a friar pressed into his hand a slip of parchment bearing only 2 words: Custos Sanguinis. At first he thought it another omen, a message meant to bind him to something larger than himself. But when he showed it to the elder, the old man only smiled faintly. You see now, even in silence, the line speaks. You need not prove yourself. The proof is already moving through the world. Still doubt gnawed at him. Could a mere rumor protect anyone? Could a scar carry the weight of an entire fallen order? The questions lingered as they moved through forests where the leaves turned gold, through villages where the people looked on with hope and fear in equal measure. Then, one night, their fragile rhythm shattered. They had taken shelter in a stone barn outside Rouen when the riders came. Black cloaks, iron helms, the seal of the Inquisition glinting in the torchlight. There was no time to run. The scarred man barred the door, shouting for the others to flee through the rear, but the youth refused. He could hear the boots pounding closer, the crack of wood as a battering ram struck. In the flicker of the lantern, the elder placed both hands on his shoulders. His voice was steady, calm as the tide. You must leave. You're not ready to face them. Not yet. The youth's chest burned, not from the scar, but from the weight of what the old man was asking. To abandon them, to save himself. The elder pressed the parchment back into his hand. Bloodlines survive because someone chooses to walk away even when everything else falls. The door cracked, splinters flew. The scarred man roared in defiance. The younger one pulled him toward the rear, through a gap in the wall where the stones had long since crumbled. They tumbled into the night, the roar of fire and steel behind them. As they ran, the youth turned once to look back. Through the smoke, he thought he saw the elder standing tall, torchlight haloing his figure, unflinching before the storm. And in that instant, the youth understood. Survival was not cowardice, it was inheritance. He ran, clutching the parchment, while behind him the barn and everything within it fell into flame. They didn't stop running until dawn stained the horizon. The younger companion collapsed in the grass, his breath ragged, while the scarred man stood guard, with eyes like sharpened iron. The youth, trembling with exhaustion, opened his fist to find the parchment still there, crumpled but unburned. The 2 words, Custos Sanguinis, seemed brighter now, as if the smoke of the night had burned away every doubt. For hours he sat in silence. The memory of the elder's calm face seared into him. He replayed every word. Bloodlines survive because someone chooses to walk away, even when everything else falls. It was not a dismissal. It was a charge, a command heavier than any sword. By midday, they reached a forest clearing where the scarred man finally spoke. The order has bled before, it will bleed again, but the line must move forward. That is why he stayed. The youth clenched the parchment tighter. He could still hear the crack of wood, the thunder of boots, the final roar of defiance that had bought them this moment of life. It felt wrong that he should sit here breathing while others lay in ashes. And yet, he began to see what the elder had meant. If he fell now, the line would vanish with him. If he lived, the story would walk farther, deeper, into time. That night, as the stars spread across the sky like cold embers, he made his first vow, not the vow of a fugitive, nor the vow of a frightened boy, but a vow of inheritance. I will carry it, he whispered, his voice steady against the wind. Not for myself, but for all who came before, and for those still waiting in the dark. The scar burned as if answering, not in pain, but in recognition. From that night forward, he no longer moved as prey. He began to walk with the rhythm of one who bore something larger than himself. something Rome could not erase with fire or iron. The bloodline was no longer just his burden. It was his purpose. And somewhere, in the silence of the woods, he thought he heard it, the faintest echo of a voice not lost in fire, but carried on the wind. Custos sanguinis, keeper of the blood. Winter came hard, sweeping across the land with winds that clawed at bone and breath. The three of them, youth, scarred man, and his younger companion, moved cautiously through forests where branches rattled like old chains, and over hills where the snow swallowed every footprint almost as soon as it was made. At times, the youth wondered if Rome's riders still followed, or if the fire at Rouen had convinced them he had perished. But then he would see a mark carved into a tree trunk, a symbol hidden in plain sight, a cross flanked by 2 dots, or a circle split with a single line. Signs meant for those who watched the roads in silence. Signs that told him he was not forgotten and that others waited. One night, in the shelter of a ruined tower, the scarred man unrolled a piece of worn leather. Etched upon it was a map, not of kingdoms or rivers, but of routes, safe houses, and hidden sanctuaries strung like beads across Europe. It was no common chart, but a living web, a testament to centuries of careful secrecy. "This is what remains," the scarred man murmured. "Not armies, not castles, only threads, carried by those who still believe. If you live long enough, boy, you will see how strong such threads can be." The youth traced the faint lines with his finger, feeling each symbol like a heartbeat beneath the leather. For the first time he saw the full scale of what had been preserved in whispers and shadows. This was not a remnant clinging to survival. It was a design, a patient architecture waiting for its moment. But survival had its cost. Hunger gnawed at them more fiercely than any enemy. Bread was scarce, and the frozen earth yielded nothing. More than once they traded relics, coins stamped with ancient marks, a silver medallion shaped like a temple dome, for food enough to last another week. Each trade felt like a small betrayal, giving away a fragment of what should have been hidden. Yet hunger left no room for purity. One bitter dawn, as the wind howled through the stones, the younger companion spoke what none had dared to say. "How long can we run?" His voice cracked with fatigue. "Even if the line survives, what is it for? To die in shadows, carrying secrets no one will ever know." The words struck hard. For a moment, silence held them. Then the youth lifted the parchment from his cloak. The 2 words, still legible despite wear. "Custos sanguinis." He answered not with certainty, but with conviction. "If I live, then the secret lives. And if it lives, one day the world will hear it again. That is enough." The scarred man's gaze softened, and the younger one bowed his head. In that moment, the youth realized something had shifted. He was no longer just the one being guarded. He was becoming the voice others leaned on when their strength faltered. The scar on his chest ached, but this time it felt less like a wound and more like a seal. A seal that would not let him forget who he was becoming. The snow finally began to soften by the time they reached the edges of Burgundy. The air smelled faintly of thaw, of wet earth waking from its long sleep. Villages stirred again, and with them came fresh dangers, eyes that lingered, tongues quick to wag, priests too eager to note strangers passing through. In one town, a parish bell tolled as they entered, its sound heavy, almost accusing. The scarred man warned them not to stay, but before they could leave, a group of children approached. They were laughing, chasing one another, but then one stopped short and stared at the youth. Slowly, she lifted her hand and drew a small cross over her chest. The others followed, not in mockery, but in something closer to awe. That night, as they sheltered in an abandoned mill, the youth could not shake the image. He asked softly, "Why do they see me this way? I am no miracle." The scarred man answered with a grunt, You are what remains. To some, that is miracle enough. The elder companion added, his voice gentle, Do not mistake legend for choice. It is placed on you, whether you want it or not. What you do with it, that is where your freedom lies. Those words clung to him. Freedom within the chains of legend. Was such a thing possible? Weeks later, on the road toward Dijon, they encountered a figure cloaked in brown, waiting by a wayside shrine. He carried no weapon, only a staff, and when he lifted his hood, his face was lined with years. His eyes, though, burned bright. I have waited for you, the man said simply. The line must not break. Before the youth could speak, the stranger pressed something into his palm, a small seal ring, its surface etched with the faint outline of a cross. This belonged to one who stood in Acre when the walls fell. It passes now to you. The weight of it was startling. The youth felt the cold metal against his skin, but also something more, an inheritance pressing into flesh and bone. He wanted to protest, to say he was unworthy, but the words caught in his throat. The stranger nodded, as if reading his hesitation. Worthiness is not given, it is lived. Remember that. Then, without another word, he turned and vanished into the trees. For a long while, none of them spoke. Finally, the scarred man muttered, Every step forward, the story grows. One day, boy, it will be too large to hide. The youth held the ring tightly, staring at its faint design in the fading light. A seal, a parchment, a scar. Each piece felt like a fragment of a puzzle he could not yet see. But the pattern was forming, whether he understood it or not. And deep within, beneath fear and weariness, a quiet flame stirred. The flame of one who had ceased running only to begin walking into destiny. Spring carried them further east, where vineyards clung to the hillsides and rivers carved silver paths through valleys. The land looked gentler than the hard winters they had survived, but beneath the budding trees lay the same tension, the constant weight of pursuit, the knowledge that one careless glance might give them away. They moved mostly at night, resting in ruined barns or caves along the river banks. Still, the youth noticed the way strangers looked at him. Some eyes carried suspicion, others something closer to reverence. Once, at a roadside inn, an old woman pressed a jug of water into his hands and whispered, "For the keeper." He froze, heart racing, but her face revealed no fear, only certainty. By now, he had learned not to ask how these people knew. Perhaps the scar across his chest spoke louder than words. Perhaps stories traveled on winds faster than footsteps. What mattered was this. The legend no longer hid in whispers. It breathed in plain sight. One night, under a canopy of stars, the scarred man spoke in a tone quieter than usual. "Do you understand why Rome fears you?" The youth hesitated, then shook his head. "They fear not what you are," the man said, "but what you could become. A banner, a spark, a story too strong to be silenced. Empires fall not only from swords, but from ideas that refuse to die." The words struck deep. For the first time, the youth began to imagine what it might mean to be more than a fugitive. Could he ever stand openly, without fear? Could he become the voice others were already whispering into existence? The next day, their journey brought them to a monastery perched high on a cliffside. Bells tolled as they climbed the winding path. The monks there, silent and hooded, gave no greeting, yet their eyes lingered long. One of them, a man with parchment-stained hands, led the youth into a chamber lined with shelves. There, upon a table, lay a book so worn its edges frayed like old cloth. The monk pushed it forward, opening to a page where symbols danced across the parchment. Crosses within circles, stars bound by lines, sigils inked centuries ago. At the center, a name, Albanus. "This was written for one who carried the line before you," the monk said softly. "It tells not only of survival, but of purpose. The youth traced the faded ink, feeling a strange kinship with a figure he had never known. Albinus, too, had been hunted. Albinus, too, had left fragments for the future, and now those fragments pressed into his hands. He closed the book gently, breath steady. For the first time, he did not feel like a boy lost in a story too vast for him. He felt like a continuation, a link in a chain that reached back into fire and forward into shadow. And in that still chamber, with candlelight flickering against the stone, he whispered the words that had followed him from the night of the fire. Custos sanguinis. Keeper of the blood. The monk bowed his head. The scarred man's hand tightened on his sword. And the youth knew his path was no longer only about survival. It was about awakening what had been buried and carrying it, whatever the cost. The summer of that year brought no peace. With every mile, the youth felt the air grow heavier, not from weather, but from rumor. In markets and taverns, his ears caught fragments, whispers of Rome's renewed hunt, of papal envoys who asked too many questions, of nobles offering coin for the boy marked with fire. By now, he no longer traveled nameless. A title followed him, reshaped in every tongue: the keeper, the heir, the child of ashes. He hated how little it resembled his true self, yet he saw how it worked. Doors opened, bread appeared, strangers risked silence in his defense. Legend had taken root, and there was no uprooting it. In Burgundy's courts, nobles played their own games with that legend. Some wished to shelter him, if only to hold leverage against Rome. Others would gladly deliver him, imagining papal favor as a richer prize. The youth learned to read eyes as carefully as he read maps. A smile could mean safety, or betrayal. One evening, the scarred man returned from a nearby town with news. The King of France has asked the Pope to cleanse the land of what remains. They believe a bloodline survived. They believe it is you. The youth's heart pounded. He had known this day would come, but hearing it aloud made the danger real. Then every step we take is watched, the scarred man finished grimly. Their path bent southward through valleys where stone towers rose like teeth against the sky. At a crossroads, they found another messenger cloaked as a pilgrim. He carried no weapon, only a rosary carved from olive wood. Pressing it into the youth's hand, he whispered, "The line is not merely survival, it is a weapon yet to be drawn. Guard it." That night, as they camped beneath the stars, the youth asked the scarred man what it meant. The older knight gazed into the fire, his face etched with shadows. A weapon may sleep for generations, but the church fears not steel, they fear the truth. Bloodlines bind memory. If yours reaches the right ears, it could unmake crowns. The younger companion stirred uneasily. And if it reaches the wrong ears? Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of flames. The youth held the olive wood rosary tightly. He realized that every gift he had been given, parchment, ring, book, and now this, was not just inheritance. They were pieces of a map, guiding him toward something vast, something dangerous. And for the first time, he felt the sharp weight of choice. To follow the path deeper was to risk all lives around him. To abandon it was to betray centuries of silent sacrifice. The scar on his chest pulsed with heat, as though the fire itself had burned through him. He closed his eyes and whispered into the night, "If truth is a weapon, then let me learn to wield it, not bury it." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of vineyards and river mist. Somewhere in the dark, a wolf howled. And he knew the hunt had only just begun. Days blurred into one another as they pressed deeper into the heart of Europe. The youth had grown leaner, harder. The softness of fear had begun to wear away, replaced by something steadier, resolve, sharpened by necessity. Yet even resolve could not shield him from the constant strain of being watched. In towns, he felt eyes linger too long. In monasteries, he heard his footsteps echo against stone, as if the very walls remembered the tales whispered about him. And in the courts of princes, he learned to mask his unease behind silence, for even silence could be taken as strength. One evening, they arrived at a manor on the edge of the Rhine, where a noblewoman agreed to give them shelter. The hall was warm, filled with tapestries of hunts and battles, yet the youth sensed a tension beneath the welcome. Over supper, she spoke softly of Rome's emissaries moving ever closer, carrying sealed letters with orders stamped in scarlet wax. "You are no longer a rumor," she said, her eyes flicking to the scarred man, then back to the youth. "You are a threat, and threats are rarely left alive." That night, unable to sleep, he wandered the manor's gallery. There, between faded banners, he saw a painting half shrouded in dust. A knight kneeling before an altar, a child beside him. The knight's tabard bore the familiar red cross, weathered but unmistakable. Beneath the painting, a single phrase had been etched: "Custos memoriae," keeper of the memory. His chest tightened. The words were not the same as those burned into him, yet they rang with eerie kinship. Memory and blood, two halves of one truth. Perhaps the bloodline was not only flesh carried forward, but also memory. The record of vows, of sacrifices, of stories Rome had tried to erase. The next morning, before they departed, the noblewoman pressed a sealed pouch into his hands. "Take this to Basel," she whispered. "There are brothers there who still remember, but beware, others will be waiting." On the road, he dared open the pouch. Inside was a fragment of parchment, brittle with age, bearing only 3 words: Sanguis, Memoria, Veritas. Blood memory, truth. The scarred man saw his expression change and asked nothing, only gave a curt nod as though he too understood that another thread had been tied. That evening, as they camped by the river, the youth stared at the water slipping endlessly toward the sea. He thought of those words: blood, memory, truth, and felt how each was a chain binding him to a past he had never chosen, and yet they were also a path illuminated by fire and silence alike. "Bloodline, memory, truth," he whispered. "If they fear these, then perhaps it is because they are stronger than any crown." The river answered only with its ceaseless murmur. But within that murmur, he thought he heard something else. The echo of voices, centuries old, urging him forward into shadows still deeper. The city of Basel lay ahead, its spires rising like spears against the evening sky. From a distance, it looked like safety. Walls strong, bridges arched across the river, smoke curling gently from hearths. But the closer they came, the more the youth felt the weight pressing down. Safety was an illusion. A city meant eyes, ears, and questions. At the gates, soldiers in the livery of the bishopric stopped them. Their questions were routine, but their gazes lingered too long on the youth. One of them muttered something under his breath. Just a word, but enough to send a chill through him. Templar. The scarred man stepped forward, his voice hard as steel. "We are pilgrims, nothing more." With a coin slipped into a palm, the guards let them pass, though their eyes followed until the group disappeared into the crowd. Within the city, narrow streets wound like veins. Merchants shouted, bells clanged, and yet beneath it all, there was a sense of watchfulness. Somewhere among the press of bodies, the youth felt a presence trailing them, never seen, but never absent. That night, in a small inn by the river, their contact arrived. A monk in plain robes, his hands ink-stained from years of scriptoria work. He spoke quietly, each word measured. The bloodline carries more than flesh. It carries covenant. What Rome fears is not only who you are, but what you remember. From beneath his robe, the monk drew a bundle wrapped in waxed cloth. Inside lay a parchment cracked with age, its Latin faint but legible. The youth leaned closer. It was not confession or prayer. It was instruction. A charter written in the days before Acre fell, signed with names he had only heard whispered, de Molay, de Beaujeu, and others long dead. The scarred man inhaled sharply. This should not exist. The monk's eyes flicked to the youth. Yet it does. Now it belongs to him. The youth touched the parchment. The words felt alive, as though centuries had waited for his eyes alone. He traced the faded ink, reading fragments. Custodite sanguinem, non in ferro, sed in memoria. Guard the blood, not in iron, but in memory. Before he could ask what it meant, the inn's door slammed. Shadows filled the room, armed men in papal surcoats spilling inside with swords drawn. Their leader's voice rang out, sharp and merciless. By order of His Holiness, surrender the boy. The scarred man was already moving, blade flashing. The younger companion pulled the youth toward the back stair, but the parchment nearly slipped from his grasp. For a heartbeat, he hesitated. If he dropped it, Rome would destroy it. If he kept it, Rome would hunt him forever. He clutched it to his chest. The clash of steel filled the inn. Screams, the crash of overturned tables, the hiss of fire as a lamp spilled. Through smoke and chaos, they fled into the alleys, the parchment still burning like a brand against his heart. And as the bells of Basel tolled the hour, the youth understood. The chase had changed. He was no longer running only for his life. He was running for the memory of an order the world thought broken, and Rome, he knew, would never stop. They plunged into the maze of Basel's back streets, the cobblestones slick with evening rain. The scarred man led them down twisting lanes, past shuttered shops and crumbling walls where shadows clung thick. Behind them, armored boots thundered closer, the ringing steel echoing like a hunter's hounds. At the river front, the smell of wet wood and tar filled the air. Barges swayed against their moorings, ropes creaking, water slapping the hulls. The younger companion pointed to a narrow skiff, barely large enough for three. Without hesitation, they slipped aboard, cutting the line as the scarred man pushed them into the current. The Rhine carried them away, but not far enough. Torches flared along the bank, voices shouting, arrows hissed through the rain, one splintering against the boat's edge. The youth crouched low, clutching the parchment tight against his chest, its brittle edges threatening to tear under his grip. "Don't let go," the scarred man growled. "That charter is worth more than all of us." The younger companion pulled at the oars, arms trembling, but the river surged strong, dragging them into the dark. For a while, only the roar of water and their own breath filled the night. Yet beneath it, the youth thought he heard something else, the faint murmur of words not spoken aloud, as though the parchment itself carried a voice. By dawn, they found shelter in the ruins of an old watchtower. The scarred man sealed the doorway with broken stone, then collapsed against the wall, blood seeping through his sleeve from a cut at his arm. "Basel is lost to us now," he said grimly. "Word will spread faster than we can travel. Every border, every port will be waiting." The youth unwrapped the parchment. In the weak morning light, the faded Latin seemed clearer, as if the ink had awakened. One line stood out, "Sanguis est clavis." Blood is the key. He whispered it, and the scarred man's eyes narrowed. Not iron, not gold, not even faith. They hid something in the blood itself. The younger companion leaned closer, pale with unease. But what could blood unlock? Silence lingered. The river murmured below. The youth felt the scar on his chest burn faintly, like a brand answering across time. And he realized the truth was not only about who had survived, but about what that survival carried. The parchment was not just memory. It was a map. And somewhere ahead, in vaults Rome had buried or mountains time had sealed, something waited for him. Something only blood could awaken. He closed the cloth over the charter, his hands steady now. Whatever lay ahead, he could no longer imagine turning away. The bloodline was no longer only his burden, it was his destiny. For weeks they drifted between villages, never staying longer than a night, always keeping to the less traveled paths. Rumor ran faster than horses. Papal riders had crossed the Rhine, inquisitors carried sketches of a youth with a scar, and merchants were bribed to report any unfamiliar faces. The scarred man kept them moving at dawn and at dusk, sleeping in barns, cellars, even in shallow caves carved into the hills. Each time the youth unwrapped the parchment, the same words pulled at his mind: sanguis est clavis. Blood is the key. One night, in a ruined chapel whose roof had long since collapsed, he dared ask what the phrase meant. The scarred man knelt by the broken altar, his voice low. The Templars guarded more than gold. They guarded a covenant. The bloodline is not a myth. It is the cipher. With the right hand to guide it, it could unseal knowledge the Church fears most. The youth's breath caught. Knowledge or power? The scarred man's eyes were tired, but unflinching. Both. Enough to fracture kingdoms, enough to remake faith itself. The younger companion shifted uneasily, glancing at the shadows creeping in through the broken stained glass. And if Rome gets it first? Neither man answered. The silence was heavier than words. The following days carried them south toward the Jura Mountains, where the land rose in jagged ridges and mist curled thick among the pines. Here, the youth began to notice signs he could not explain. Shepherds who watched him too closely. A carved cross on a stone cairn, old but freshly cleaned of moss. A symbol scratched into a door frame, the same as the ring he carried. It was as though unseen hands were marking his path. One evening, at a shepherd's hut, an old woman offered them bread. As she placed it in his hand, she whispered in a tongue, not Latin but close enough for him to understand. The blood remembers. His pulse quickened. He wanted to ask more, but she pressed a finger to her lips and turned away. Later, when the others slept, the youth sat outside beneath the stars. He thought of the words, of the way strangers seemed to know fragments of him he had never shared. The parchment in his cloak rustled faintly in the wind, and for an instant he swore he heard a whisper threaded through the air. Not in Latin this time, but in his own language. Clear, intimate, undeniable. You are not running. You are returning. The fire cracked, the horses stirred, and the night grew still again, but the words lingered. And deep inside, he felt a certainty taking shape. This journey was not only escape, nor only survival. It was a summons, and soon he would have to answer it. Snow dusted the ridges when they finally reached the high pass. The path was little more than a goat's trail carved into stone, narrow enough that one misstep would send them tumbling into the abyss below. Wind howled across the peaks, carrying with it the smell of pine and something older, sharper, the mineral scent of mountains that had stood long before kingdoms. The youth pressed a hand to the parchment hidden beneath his cloak. Each step seemed to stir it, as if the brittle fibers hummed against his chest. Blood is the key. The phrase no longer felt like metaphor. It felt like a summons, and the mountains themselves seemed to echo it. By dusk, they reached a plateau where the ruins of a fortress clung to the rock face. Its towers had long collapsed, its gates nothing more than blackened beams, yet the scarred man halted, his breath visible in the cold air. This was theirs, he said. A commandery, burned after Acre fell, but not everything was destroyed. The youth walked slowly through the wreckage. Charred stones, fragments of a tile, a broken sword half buried in snow. Yet beneath it all, the silence was not empty. It pressed close, as though the mountain itself still remembered the prayers whispered here centuries ago. In the center of the courtyard, a single arch remained intact, its stones weathered but steady. Carved along its inner curve was a phrase so worn it could barely be read. Non omnis moria. I shall not wholly die. The youth reached out, his fingers tracing the letters. At his touch, the scar on his chest burned, sharp, insistent, alive. He staggered back, gasping, and the parchment in his cloak seemed to shiver in answer. The scarred man caught his arm. "What did you see?" "Not see," the youth whispered. "Feel, as if something in the stone knows me." The younger companion knelt, brushing snow from the base of the arch. Beneath the frost, a shallow groove emerged, a hollow cut into the foundation, just wide enough for a hand. The youth's breath quickened. He knew before anyone spoke what it demanded. Blood. For a long moment, he hesitated. Then, drawing the dagger from his belt, he pricked his palm and pressed it into the hollow. The stone was cold, unyielding. Then, with a low groan, it shifted. Dust fell, snow trembled, and from within the arch a hidden panel slid open. Inside lay a chest, iron-bound, its surface etched with the same cross he had seen in his dreams. The scarred man dropped to one knee, awe flickering across his weathered face. "It lives," he whispered. "After all these years, it lives." The youth stared at the chest. His blood still dampened the stone, his scar still burned, and the mountain wind whipped around him like a chorus. For the first time he understood. This was no longer a story of survival. This was inheritance, and whatever waited inside the chest, Rome had been right to fear it. The chest was heavy, its iron bands scarred with age but intact, as though centuries of snow and storm had not touched it. The scarred man and his younger companion pried it free from the stone, their breath steaming in the frigid air. It thudded onto the frozen ground with a weight that was more than metal, more than oak. The youth knelt beside it. His hand hovered over the latch, but he did not move. The scar on his chest throbbed with every heartbeat, as if warning him that whatever lay within would not be easily carried. The scarred man's voice broke the silence. "Once it is opened, you cannot turn back. Whatever you see, whatever you learn, it will bind you to the same vow that consumed us." The youth looked at him, then at the younger companion, whose eyes were wide, caught between awe and dread. At last, he drew the dagger again and pressed its edge beneath the latch. With a groan of rusted hinges, the chest opened. Inside were not gold coins nor jeweled relics, but manuscripts, scrolls wrapped in oilskin, a codex bound in red leather, fragments of parchment so delicate they seemed to tremble in the wind. And at the center, wrapped in cloth, darkened with age, a vial no larger than a finger, its glass cloudy, its contents the deep color of dried wine. The younger companion whispered, "Blood." The scarred man's face hardened. "Not just any. This is the covenant." The youth reached for the vial, his hand trembling. The moment his skin brushed the glass, the scar on his chest seared with fire. Images flashed behind his eyes, battles under a burning sky, knights in white mantles kneeling in shadowed chapels, a voice intoning words he could not understand but somehow remembered. He dropped the vial, gasping. The scarred man caught it before it shattered, cradling it with reverence. "You see now," he said softly, "this is why they hunted us. Not for treasure, not for land, but for what was promised in this blood. A lineage that would never die. A memory carried not in ink or stone, but in flesh itself." The youth staggered back, staring at the manuscripts. Each bore sigils he half recognized, symbols that mirrored the dreams that had haunted him since childhood. And he knew, though no one had told him, that they spoke of the same truth. The order had never ended. It had hidden itself in blood, waiting for him to open the way. From the valley below, a horn sounded. The scarred man froze, listening. Then he cursed under his breath. "They've found us." The youth's gaze lingered on the chest. He wanted to read, to understand, to hold every page until it made sense. But the sound of hooves climbing the pass grew louder, echoing through the stone like a drum beat. The scarred man seized the codex and the vial, thrusting them into the youth's arms. "Run! Whatever happens, run! You are the bloodline. You are the key." And in that frozen fortress, with snow swirling like ashes and horns calling the hunters nearer, the youth realized his life was no longer his own. He was not just fleeing death. He was carrying the last breath of the Templars themselves. The wind roared down from the peaks as if the mountains themselves were warning them to move. The scarred man shoved the youth toward a crumbling stairwell that led deeper into the ruined fortress. "Go," he barked, his voice half lost in the gale. The youth stumbled forward, clutching the codex and vial against his chest. The younger companion followed, casting frantic glances behind as the sound of hooves and shouted orders grew nearer. The clank of armor was unmistakable. Papal riders, trained, relentless, and too close. They plunged into a lower hall, where ice hung in thick sheets from the ceiling. Their footsteps rang against flagstones worn smooth by centuries of forgotten prayers. Torchlight flickered against damp walls, revealing faded frescoes, saints, angels, and, beneath the layers of soot, a faint red cross. The sight sent a shiver through the youth. The scarred man caught up, his sword drawn. His face was grim but steady. "There's a way out. A tunnel cut into the mountain, used when this place fell. If it hasn't collapsed, it will carry us to the forest on the far side." "If," the younger companion muttered, fear sharp in his voice. The scarred man ignored him, pushing them onward. Behind, the fortress groaned under the weight of intruders. The papal riders stormed through the gates, their shouts echoing down the halls. "Find them! The boy carries it!" The youth's heart hammered, the scar on his chest burning like an open wound. The codex seemed heavier now, as if the words inside were alive, demanding to be opened even in the face of death. But there was no time. He kept running, every step echoing with the truth. He was not just fleeing. He was chosen. At last, they reached a wall where the stones had been pried apart centuries ago, leaving a low, jagged tunnel. Cold air hissed through it, carrying the scent of pine and snow. Escape. The scarred man ducked inside first, sword in hand. "Stay close," he hissed. They crawled, the youth's hands scraping against sharp rock. The codex pressed so tightly against him he could feel the ridges of its cover against his ribs. Behind, voices thundered closer, boots striking stone, blades clashing as the last defenses of the fortress fell. Halfway through the tunnel, the youth froze. The parchment in his cloak rustled, though he had not touched it. For a breathless moment, he heard the whisper again, soft, low, and utterly clear. "Do not run from who you are." He clenched his teeth, forcing himself forward. The tunnel opened at last onto the mountainside. The forest stretched below like a dark sea. The scarred man stood watch at the mouth, his blade glinting faintly in the pale dawn light. Down the slope, quickly. But as the youth stepped into the open, horns blared again from the ridge above. The papal riders had split, circling the mountain. Soon, the forest itself would be no refuge. The scarred man turned, his face lined with the weight of choice. He met the youth's eyes and spoke with iron certainty. "You carry what matters. If one of us must stay, it will be me." The youth shook his head violently, but the scarred man silenced him with a look, one that carried the weight of vows made long before the youth had been born. "Go," he whispered. And then he turned back toward the tunnel, sword raised, ready to meet the storm alone. The clash of steel rang behind him as the youth half slid, half fell down the slope. Branches whipped at his face, snow and mud churned under his boots, and still he clutched the codex and vial so tightly that his knuckles burned white. The younger companion stumbled close behind, gasping for breath, eyes wide with terror. From above, the sound of combat thundered through the tunnel mouth. Shouts, screams, the raw metallic rhythm of blades striking. Then silence. A silence so sudden it was louder than the fight itself. The youth froze, chest heaving. He wanted to turn back, to climb the slope and drag the scarred man to safety, but the younger companion seized his arm. "If you go, it's over," he hissed. "He gave himself so you wouldn't. Don't waste it." The youth's throat tightened. Snowflakes clung to his lashes, blurring the world. He stumbled on, his legs moving without thought, each step down the slope pulling him further from the man who had been his shield, his teacher, his anchor. At the forest's edge, they collapsed beneath the pines. The younger companion pressed his forehead to the ground, whispering something between a prayer and a curse. The youth pulled the codex from beneath his cloak, his hands trembling so hard he nearly dropped it. When he unlatched it, the parchment inside glowed faintly, as though catching light from nowhere. The ink shimmered like oil on water. Words leapt from the page, phrases in Latin he only half understood, but felt more than read. Sanguis est clavis, sanguis est via. Blood is the key, blood is the path. The scar on his chest flared with heat, and his vision swam. Suddenly he saw not the forest, but a hall lit by candles, knights in white mantles kneeling in a circle, their faces lost to shadow. In the center lay the same vial he now held, resting on a pedestal of stone. One knight spoke, his voice deep and solemn. "Guard this covenant, for kingdoms will rise and fall, but the blood will endure." The vision snapped away. He was back in the forest, his breath ragged, the codex warm in his hands, as though alive. The younger companion stared at him. "What did you see?" The youth swallowed hard. Not the end, the beginning. Above them, horns blared again. The papal riders were not finished. Their quarry had escaped the fortress, and the hunt would not stop until the vial was in their grasp, or until the bloodline itself was extinguished. The youth tightened his grip on the codex. The forest around him felt different now, not just refuge, but a passage. A living labyrinth that would test him, lead him, perhaps even swallow him whole. He rose to his feet, his voice low but steady. "We keep moving. No matter what we lose, no matter who we lose, we carry this forward." And with the weight of the scar still burning on his chest, he stepped deeper into the trees, into the shadows that whispered promises as old as Rome itself. The forest swallowed them in its vastness. Pines rose like black pillars into the sky, their branches weaving a roof that blocked the pale light of dawn. Snow muffled their footsteps, but every crack of a twig sounded like a trumpet blast in the youth's ears. The world here was both sanctuary and snare, silent enough to hide them, alive enough to betray them. For hours they pressed deeper, guided by deer paths and the faint rush of a stream cutting through the valley. The younger companion muttered under his breath, half prayers, half curses. His fear was contagious, but the youth held fast to the codex, its weight grounding him even as his mind swirled. By midday, the trees thinned, opening onto a hollow where ruins lay scattered. Moss-covered stones, arches broken by centuries of frost, a fragment of a tower leaning like a finger pointing into heaven. It was no village, but something older, forgotten. Perhaps Roman, perhaps older still. The youth slowed, his chest tightening. The scar beneath his tunic prickled. The scar beneath his tunic prickled as if the stones themselves were breathing against his skin. He stepped into the hollow, and the ruined place answered him the way a seashell answers the ear. Quiet at first, then full of a sound too old to name. Pillars lay toppled like fallen trunks. An arch, half-standing, cast a crescent of shadow over a floor traced with faint lines, circles within circles. Lichen hid most of the pattern, but where the lichen thinned, he could see geometry that matched the sketches in the codex. A wheel of 8 spokes, a cross doubled upon itself, a compass rose without letters. They moved slowly. Wind threaded the open stones and came back as a low hum. The younger companion brushed moss from a knee-high plinth and found a line of chipped Latin, Memoria custodit quod ferro non potest. Memory keeps what iron cannot. He unwrapped the codex. It felt warmer than the air, as if it had been carried into a room where a fire still burned. The vellum crackled when he turned a page. There, drawn with the same careful hand that had annotated maps and scars, was this very hollow, named not as a fortress or shrine, but Concordia. He traced a line of marginal script with his fingertip. The letters were faded to the color of tea, but he knew them. Sanguis est clavis, memoria est porta. Blood is the key, memory is the door. A shallow bowl stood at the center of the pattern. Stone, smooth as riverbed, stained darker than the rock around it. At its lip, more words. Non omnis morea. I shall not wholly die, the phrase from the mountain arch. The echo made the hair rise on his arms. He knelt and lifted the vial from within his cloak. The glass was cloudy, the size of his smallest finger, sealed with dark wax stamped long ago. He did not want to open it. He wanted, with a longing that felt like grief, to carry it untouched until he was as old as the stones. But the codex had not been coy. Blood is the key. He set the vial on the bowl's rim and glanced at the younger companion. Only a drop, the other whispered, as if speaking to the vial and not to him. He worked the wax seal with his thumbnail. It crumbled like old bark. The stopper came free with the softest sigh. The scent that rose was not rot or iron, nothing harsh, more like damp earth after a hard rain. He tipped, and a bead gathered, weighed itself, and fell. It hit the bowl and held there, a garnet bead trembling, then spread thinly along a carved groove that spiraled inward. For a breath, nothing. Then a line of darkness chased the drop, ink waking under the stone. Letters unfurled around the bowl in a slow bloom, not scratched, not painted, revealed. He swallowed hard. He had seen parchment take ink. He had never seen stone accept it. The words were Latin, but plain, as if a man had spoken them and the bowl remembered. Custos sanguinis. If your hand has opened this, the line still walks. What we could not guard by sword, we bound to memory. Do not seek crowns. Do not summon armies. Walk, carry the names, keep the road between those who remember. Blood is the key not to power, but to witness. When iron fails, let memory stand. He leaned on the rim until his brow touched the stone. His throat felt tight and clean at the same time as when the first cold air of winter hits the lungs. It was not a prophecy. It was instructions. Not a coronation, but a charge. A soft scrape pulled him back. The younger companion had brushed lichen from a square at the bowl's base, no bigger than a book cover, revealing a panel fitted so well he would have missed it in full daylight. There's a seam, the other murmured, and a mark. Look. Etched at the panel's edge, a cross within a cross, the little geometry that had followed him through maps and dreams. Beside it, a shallow notch the size of a thumb. The youth set down the codex and pressed his thumb into the notch, expecting nothing, and still flinched when the stone gave like a held breath released. The square slid inward, then up and away. Within lay a leather tube tied with 2 narrow cords and sealed with a bead of tin. Beside it, a ring, not ornate, iron band, plain cross, which fit the hollow as if it had slept there since the bowl was new. He did not touch the ring. He lifted the tube as if lifting a child. The cords parted. A roll of thin vellum slid into his hand. It was cramped with names, places, persons, routes. half the words he recognized from whispers, and half from the margins of the codex that had never made sense until now. At the bottom, a note in a different hand, the strokes more hurried, like someone writing on a saddle bow. If this reaches you, the road from Concordia still lives. Take the eastern spur, trust the silent houses, avoid the abbess at... The ink broke there, smudged. 2 more lines washed into ghosts. He breathed out through his nose, steadying himself. The bowl's letters were still visible, the spiral of script dulling as the drop thinned. Blood is the key not to power, but to witness. He looked at the vial, at the codex, at the vellum of names, and felt something inside him set like tempered metal, not lighter, truer. A sound of dogs came from very far off, then nearer. Not the lazy bark of a farmyard night, but the unbroken, hungry note of animals on leash. The younger companion went rigid. They've taken the lower road through the pines. He capped the vial and sealed it with wax warmed over the stub of a candle from the pack. His hands worked with the calm of someone whose terror has nowhere useful to go. He slid vial and vellum into his cloak, took the codex under his arm, and reached for the ring at last. It was cold and ordinary. When he slipped it on, it warmed as if the hand had made a home for it. The dogs' voices lifted, echoed, split. More than one pack then, or a ravine giving their sound multiple mouths. He stood, and the chamber's hum shifted, a tone he had not noticed earlier, like a bowl struck lightly by a fingernail. He turned his head. The sound seemed to come from the wall opposite the broken arch, where vines had matted in a dark, wet beard. The pattern on the floor seemed to point there, too, the faintest suggestion of a spoke ending at that wall. He crossed the room and pressed the moss aside. Stone, yes, but slicker with seepage than the others, cool as a cellar door. He let his palm travel the face until he felt the shallowest cup. He placed his hand against it, not bleeding this time, just skin to stone. The hum deepened a note. Then a line opened. No dramatic groan, no drama at all, simply an admission, as if a second door had always been there and had finally remembered its job. Behind it, darkness that felt like air, not like stone. The younger companion touched his shoulder. Urgent. We go. Not yet. He went back to the bowl and with his thumb smeared the last of the drop across 3 words so they would darken and hold. Memoria. Porta. Veritas. Memory. Door. Truth. He didn't know why he did it, only that it felt like telling the room that he had heard it. The dogs found the edge of the hollow. He could hear men now, the harsh language of command, the clatter that broke ruins make when boots don't care. He slid into the narrow, felt the second door close him in with a sigh, and let the dark take his eyes. It was not dead dark. A draft, a thread of light, then a bend, the line of a stair hacked out of living rock, the roof low enough to bow the head. They moved with hands on the wall. The sound of the hollow narrowed to a memory, and then was gone, replaced by their own breath in the faint patter of water somewhere ahead. They went down 3 flights by feel alone. On the 4th, the stair opened into a long corridor where a trickle ran down the center like a shallow vein. The air smelled of lime and old water jars, the mineral sweetness of stone that has slept a long time. When they paused to listen back, there was nothing. Not silence that means safety, but the pause in a hunt when the dogs have too many scents. He lit the candle. The flame leaned forward and showed him that the corridor's walls were not bare. Faint lines traced them, as if hands had passed and left the memory of maps. He raised the light and saw the circle again. The compass without letters, then a series of marks like stitches. Short, long, the cadence of roads. The cadence of names. The vellum's list, but carved a lifetime earlier. "Do you see it?" he whispered. The younger companion nodded, a sound, not a sight. a road under the road. He put the candle to the ring, and for a strange second thought he saw the faintest answering glimmer in the iron. Not light, not magic, recognition. He laughed under his breath, the slightest thing, surprised to hear his own voice sound like relief. They moved again. The corridor bent left, then right, then lowered until they were crouching and then crawling, the codex jammed safe against his ribs. They came to a place where the trickle widened into a shallow basin no bigger than a shield. He knelt to drink and saw, beneath the tremble of the candle, another line cut into the stone lip. Si sanguis clavis est, memento cuius ostium aperius. If blood is the key, remember whose door you open. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Somewhere above, the dogs had quieted. He did not trust that quiet. He rose and turned, and the corridor widened without warning into a chamber lit by a slit of daylight no wider than a man's 2 fingers pressed together. Dust hung in the beam like slow rain. On the floor a scatter of pebbles held the memory of bare footsteps, old, the edges softened. Men had passed here once when the corridor was new. He swallowed the thought and set it aside. The living needed him more than the dead. Listen, the younger companion said. He did, not for pursuers now, but for the outside. What came to him was the thin, far-off talk of wind in high leaves. It sounded like summer, like safety he did not believe in, and yet... He tucked the codex close, checked the vial with his fingertips, felt the ring steady against bone. We keep east, he said, voice steady for both of them. We take the spur named on the vellum. We find the silent houses. And if the dogs find the first door, they will, he said simply. But the stone remembers who opened it. They left the pale square of daylight behind in favor of the drawn map on the wall, a line that promised nothing but distance and another chance. As they moved, he felt the scar ease its burning and settle into a warmth that was almost a hand at his back. The word from the bowl kept with him, a quiet that did not fray under the weight of fear. Witness. Not crown, not conquest. Witness. The corridor bent once more and tilted upward into a throat of rock that breathed a colder air. Far ahead, light bloomed again. Not a slit this time, but a low mouth opening in a hillside somewhere beyond the ruin. He did not smile, but the set of his shoulders changed. The ring sat easy. The codex felt like a living thing against his heart, and when he reached the lip and looked out over the grey-green of a valley he had never seen, he did not feel small. Behind them, the hollow listened to strangers and kept its own counsel. Ahead of them, the country rolled in long breaths. He touched the place over his scar, and the words he had smeared into the stone rose like a blessing that did not need a priest to be true. Memory, door, truth. The valley stretched out like a page waiting for ink. Ridges sloped into one another, folded with mist, their colors shifting between iron gray and moss green as the clouds moved. A river shone in the distance, glinting like a piece of glass left in the grass. Villages might have lain along its banks, but from here there was no smoke, no movement, only the hush of a land that had learned to keep its secrets. The youth stood at the cave mouth, his breath rising white in the cold air. The younger companion crouched beside him, clutching the cloak tighter, eyes darting along the ridges as though enemies might already be waiting. But the only sound was wind, carrying the smell of pine and a faint mineral tang from unseen springs. He took a step out, boots crunching on gravel. Each sound seemed louder than it should, as if the valley itself was listening. The codex under his arm felt heavier now, not like a burden, but like a weight that asked to be carried carefully. He thought of the names written on the vellum pulled from the hollow, of the hand that had scrawled them centuries earlier with the same urgency he now felt. Names of places, of allies, of houses that remembered. Silent houses. They followed a faint deer track sloping down from the hillside, the kind of path worn not by armies but by animals, passing season after season. As they walked, the youth traced his finger against the iron ring, turning it slowly. It was plain, unadorned, and yet it warmed against his skin as though it held some quiet knowledge of its own. He wondered how many before him had worn it. How many had slipped it onto their hand in moments of fear or hope, and whether it had whispered the same calm into them. Halfway down the slope, the younger companion stumbled, pointing with a stiff finger. In a patch of mud softened by snow melt lay a series of prints, not boots, not hooves, but bare feet, wide and long, the edges blurred by weather. The youth crouched and studied them, old, perhaps days, perhaps weeks, but human, and heading east, the same direction they had to go. "Do you think—" the companion began. "I don't know," the youth said, "but someone has walked this path before us. That's enough." The prince reassured and unsettled him in equal measure. Proof that the valley was not empty. Proof, too, that they might not be alone in ways they couldn't yet measure. By late afternoon they reached the valley floor. The river's sound met them before its sight, the low rushing whisper of water against stone. When they stepped through the last line of trees, the current spread before them in silver ribbons. The youth knelt and washed his hands. The water was shockingly cold, biting like needles, and he felt the scar along his side flare as if reminded of its old wound. He pressed his palm against it and whispered, not a prayer exactly, but words meant to be heard, witness, door, truth. The sun dipped behind the western ridge, and the valley grew violet and blue. A hawk wheeled overhead, then vanished into shadow. Across the river stood a low shape that could have been a hill or a roofline. The younger companion squinted. "Do you see it? There, just beyond the trees." The youth narrowed his eyes. "Yes. Angular where the land was not. A wall, perhaps. Or the bones of a building." The thought quickened his steps. They crossed by a shallow ford where the stones showed like the backs of fish. On the far side, a cluster of broken walls rose among the birches, their stones weathered but still standing. Carvings marked some of them, crosses within crosses, faint but unmistakable. Silent houses. The vellum had not lied. Inside the ruin, under a roof long gone, they found what looked like an altar stone, cracked down the center. On its face was another phrase, worn nearly smooth. Qui meminit vivit. Who remembers? Lives. Beneath the crack, a hollow where offerings might once have been laid, now held only leaves and dust. The youth sat on the stone. For the first time in days, his shoulders eased. The words in the codex and the bowl had not been illusions. There were houses still, even if they were ruins that remembered. He placed the codex on the altar and opened to the page of the hollow. The symbols there matched the carvings here, thread and echo across centuries. The younger companion sat beside him, silent for a long time. Then softly, "If blood is the key, what will they ask of you next?" The youth did not answer. He traced the line of the cracked stone, feeling its roughness, its break. He thought of the bowl, of the whispering letters, of the ring warming his hand. He thought of the hunters in the pines, of the dogs that had tasted his scent. He thought of memory itself and how it kept what iron could not. Night fell over the valley. The stars came one by one, steady and indifferent. In the ruin of the silent houses, the two companions lay close to the altar stone, cloaked against the cold. The codex lay between them like a sleeping heart. And as the youth closed his eyes, he felt, just at the edge of hearing, the faintest hum. Stone remembering stone, voice remembering voice. Not promise, not threat, only memory and the endless task of carrying it forward. At dawn, the ruin was filled with frost. Each stone glistened as though dusted with crushed glass, every crack outlined in white. The youth stirred awake before his companion, his breath rising into the dim light like smoke from a dying fire. The codex lay on the altar where he had left it, its pages slightly curled by the cold. He touched the vellum, warm, warmer than the air, as though it resisted the chill of the valley. He rose and walked through the ruin, tracing the walls with his hand. His fingers found grooves where chisels had once cut lines sharp and deep. Some were names, others symbols, and a few marks so old their meaning had blurred into mystery. At one corner he paused. Carved into a half-collapsed lintel was a circle with 3 lines radiating outward. He had seen it before, in the codex margins, repeated like a refrain. His scar pulsed beneath the tunic, a faint throb that kept time with his heartbeat. It always came at moments like this, when the past leaned close enough to brush against him. He pressed his palm against it, and the pressure steadied him. The younger companion awoke with a start, shivering. "It's colder than the mountain here," he muttered, pulling the cloak tighter. His eyes followed the youth's gaze to the symbol. "Do you think it's another key?" "Not a key," the youth said softly. "A reminder." He stepped back, considering the ruin not as broken walls, but as something once whole. A house where voices had echoed, where firelight had painted shadows, where oaths had been spoken. Silent houses did not mean empty houses. Memory lingered even when bodies were gone. They moved cautiously through the structure, noting other carvings. A pair of wings on a stone near the ground, an inscription so faint it could only be read by touch. Sanguis non perit. Blood does not perish. The words made the companion uneasy, but the youth felt a calm spread through him. It was confirmation, not curse. By mid-morning they found what remained of a stairwell descending into the earth. Half collapsed, filled with rubble, but unmistakable. The codex had marked a chamber below. Together they cleared stones with numbed fingers until the gap was wide enough to slip through. The air below was heavy and damp, thick with the smell of soil and time. Their torches sputtered as they descended, flames fighting against the weight of the dark. At the bottom lay a small chamber lined with stone niches. Some were empty, some still held fragments of bone, and at the far end rested a chest of oak bound with iron, blackened by centuries. The youth approached slowly, his scar burned hot, almost unbearable, as if warning and urging him all at once. He placed the ringed hand on the lid. The iron was cold, but beneath it thrummed a faint vibration, like a heartbeat too slow to belong to any living creature. The companion whispered, "Maybe we should leave it. Maybe it was buried for a reason." The youth shook his head. "If blood is the key, then this is the lock." He lifted the lid. Inside lay a vessel of stone, carved with the same radiating circle he had seen on the lintel above. Its surface was rough, yet it glowed faintly in the torchlight, veins of quartz catching fire. Next to it, wrapped in brittle cloth, was a strip of parchment inked with words too faded to read, except for the last line, "Memonis est vivere." To remember is to live. The scar on his chest flared until his vision blurred, and he fell to his knees, clutching the vessel. The codex in his satchel rustled as though stirred by wind, though the air was still. The younger companion caught his arm, frightened, but the youth only whispered one word through clenched teeth, "Alive." The torchlight flickered against the damp stone, painting the chamber in restless shadows. The youth held the vessel close, his breath ragged, the scar burning as though some ember had been pressed beneath his skin. The stone was heavier than it looked, dense with an unseen weight, yet it seemed to pulse faintly in his grasp, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The younger companion backed away a step, eyes wide. "It feels wrong," he whispered, "like we're touching something that doesn't belong to us." The youth steadied himself against the wall. It doesn't belong to anyone. That's the point. It was never meant for a single hand. It was meant to be carried. His voice wavered, not from doubt, but from the pressure building in his chest. He set the vessel on the cracked altar stone that stood in the chamber's center. The quartz veins caught the firelight, glowing more brightly now, as though it drew power from the words carved on the walls. Sanguis non perit. Meminis es vivere. Blood does not perish. To remember is to live. The codex slid halfway out of his satchel, pages trembling as though caught in a draught. He opened it with unsteady hands. On the vellum page marked with the same circle and lines motif, fresh letters bled into view, as if ink unseen for centuries was awakening. They formed not a message, but a sequence of names, each marked with a line, each line ending with a date that stretched across generations. The companion leaned in. "Are these—" "Lineage," the youth said. His throat tightened. "This is the record. Every bearer, every house that kept it safe." His finger traced down the list until it stopped at a blank line, waiting. A low sound rose in the chamber, not from the vessel, not from the codex, but from the stone walls themselves. It was like the groan of earth after rain, like distant thunder buried in the marrow of the mountain. The younger companion dropped to his knees, covering his ears, but the youth stood still, letting the sound wash over him. The scar on his chest throbbed in rhythm with it. Each beat was like a drum, each pulse a reminder that he was part of this chain, whether he chose it or not. He pressed his hand against it and whispered, "I hear you." The sound faded. In its place was silence, so deep it seemed alive. The youth looked down at the codex again. The blank line remained, waiting for a name. The younger companion's voice trembled. "If it's meant to be yours, will you write it?" The youth closed the codex gently, tying its leather cord shut. "Not yet. To write it is to bind it, and I don't know if I'm ready." He lifted the vessel from the altar. Its glow dimmed slightly as though accepting his hesitation. From above, the faint cry of a bird pierced the air, a hawk circling. Daylight was shifting. Their torches had burned low. The youth turned toward the stairwell. "We can't stay here. The ruin is a beginning, not a refuge." Together, they climbed back into the valley air. The frost had melted, the river ran bright, and the mountains loomed with their usual indifference. Yet for the youth, everything had changed. The codex was heavier, the vessel was warmer, and the scar on his chest no longer felt like a wound but like a seal. High on the ridge, something moved, too far to see clearly, but large enough to break the line of trees. The youth froze, clutching the vessel tighter. The younger companion's hand went to his knife, though both knew it would be no use if the hunters had found them. The wind shifted. The sound of a horn drifted down the valley. Low, mournful, but deliberate. The youth whispered, "They know." The horn echoed a second time. Longer now, rolling down the slopes like a tide of iron. The youth gripped the vessel tighter against his chest, feeling its pulse align with his own heartbeat. The younger companion's eyes searched the ridges, but the figures remained shadows, their movement more felt than seen. They descended the hill slowly, deliberately, not as fugitives, but as those who carried something greater than themselves. Each step pressed into the earth as if marking their passage in a land that remembered. The river's rush grew louder behind them, a voice urging them onward. At the base of the slope stood a figure, cloaked, hood drawn, still as a carved post. The youth stopped. He could not see the face beneath the hood, only the faint gleam of metal where a hand rested on a staff capped with iron. When the figure spoke, the voice was neither young nor old. "You've opened the houses." The scar seared under the youth's ribs, yet he held his ground. They were never closed, only forgotten. The cloaked figure tilted the staff, studying him. "You carry what does not belong to you." The youth shook his head. "It belongs to memory, and memory cannot be claimed." Silence. Wind stirred through the grass, bending it like waves. The companion tensed, ready to draw his knife, but the youth raised a hand to still him. The figure stepped closer, slow, deliberate. For a moment, the torchlight from their pack glinted across the hood, showing only the outline of a scar carved across the cheek. The staff pressed into the ground with a sound like a bell struck faintly. "Then carry it," the figure said. "But know this: blood remembers, and blood calls." Without another word, the cloaked watcher turned and moved back into the trees, vanishing between the shadows as though swallowed whole. The younger companion released a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "Why let us go?" The youth looked down at the vessel, its faint glow steady in his arms. "Because this isn't the end. It's the beginning, and they know it as well as we do." The valley grew quiet again, as if satisfied that nothing more would happen tonight. Stars crowded the sky, sharp and cold. The youth lifted the codex, brushing his hand across the blank line that had waited for him in the chamber below. For the first time, he did not feel dread, but a quiet certainty. His name would be written one day, not in ink alone, but in the path he carved, in the choices he made. He and his companion turned toward the east, where the ridges opened into a passage that led out of the valley. Their shadows stretched long in the starlight, two figures carrying more than they understood, but less than eternity demanded. The vessel warmed in his arms, the codex heavy at his side, and the scar beat softly beneath his skin. Above them, in the cold sky, the hawk wheeled once and vanished into the dark, and with that, the story of the Bloodline slipped quietly into its next chapter, unfinished, unbroken, and alive in the memory of those willing to carry it forward. And so, our journey closes where all stories of blood and memory must, at the edge of mystery, with more questions than answers. Perhaps that is how it was always meant to be. The Templars, the Vatican, the whispered bloodlines, they leave us fragments, symbols, echoes carved in stone. The rest we carry in imagination. If you've stayed with me until this final moment, I want to thank you. Wherever you're listening from, whether it's late night in America, dawn in Europe, or the quiet hours in Asia, we've been walking the same path together, across time and across silence. If these stories speak to you, if you want to hear more voices from the shadows of history, I invite you, subscribe, leave a like, share this with someone who also hungers for forgotten truths. And if you wish to support the deeper digging, you'll find a link below. Every gesture, large or small, keeps these stories alive. For now, let the mystery rest. Let the tide wash over the ruins, the stars settle above the mountains, and the echoes fade into quiet. Sleep well, with the comfort of knowing that history never truly disappears. It only waits for us to listen.